We're in North Caucasus on December 31st, 1994, just hours before the new year. However, the residents of Chechenia's capital Grozny are now fleeing the city instead of celebrating with their families. Those who have nowhere to go are hiding. 9-year-old Polina Zhuriptsova, a native of Grozny, unlike Russian children that day, she wouldn't open her presents. Instead, she'd write in her diary.
January 1st, 1995. All night there were shootings aimed at the house. We were lying on the corridor floor because there were no windows in the corridor. Before that, we were sitting on sledges in the bathroom. Our house was shaking. It was burning. Tanks were going down the street shooting. The rumbling was very scary. Planes dropped bombs. Then a missile hit nearby. It was so shattering that a window grill fell off in our kitchen, hitting my mother, grandmother Nina, and Aunt Valia.
The Russian federal government presented to the people of Chechnya, who dared to believe they are independent, a perverted gift by striking Grozny on New Year's Eve, using all its military might, with the intent of shocking, intimidating, and bringing Chechens on their knees in a matter of hours. But as usual, nothing went according to the plan. In the year of 1990, the collapse of the Soviet Union became inevitable when the Baltic republics of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia proclaimed their independence, demonstrating that the Soviet government could no longer maintain the integrity of the country. A few months later, the process known as the Sovereignty Parade began in the Caucasus. The former Chechen Ingush Soviet Republic announced its independence from the USSR and Russia in July 1991. However, neither the USSR nor the newly formed Russian Federation recognized the independence of Chechnya. This created a ticking time bomb in North Caucasus. But despite the lack of formal recognition, at the beginning of the 90s, Ichkeria existed as an independent state, led by former Soviet general, President Johar Dudayev. At the time, Russia was undergoing severe transformation crisis and lacked the resources to fight separatism. However, the situation changed dramatically in 1993. Dudayev was opposed by the Chechen parliament, and Russia saw an opportunity in this political crisis. Tension between Dudayev and the parliament escalated into armed conflict in 1994, when the Chechen parliament formed the Provisional Council, declaring Chechnya an integral part of Russian Federation. In response, Moscow immediately supported this declaration. Initially, Russia intended to support Provisional Council without directly invading Chechnya, but they failed to gain a decisive advantage over Dudayev. Thus, by the end of 1994, Russia decided to physically destroy Dudayev and his followers and regain control over the Chechen Republic. During the Security Council in December 1994, Defense Minister Pavel Grachev assured Russian President Boris Yeltsin,
"I can take Grozny with just one airborne assault regiment in 2 hours."
"No, you can't. Silly." It was clear that Grachev had no understanding of the situation. He relied on instilling fear by using artillery, aviation, and heavy armored vehicles. He was convinced that the bearded savages would flee at the sound of tank engines. Let's see what actually happened. Not in Grachev's fantasies, but in reality. The initial plan was to attack Grozny simultaneously from 4 directions: north, northeast, east, and west. The militants were supposed to enter the city, take control over major administrative and infrastructure buildings, set up checkpoints at major crossroads, and then proceed to capturing the president's palace. Group North consisted of 4,096 militants, 82 tanks, 211 armored vehicles, and 88 artillery units. Group Northeast had 2,228 men, 7 tanks, 254 armored vehicles, and 27 artillery units. Group East had 2,925 men, 43 tanks, 222 various armored machines, and 33 units of artillery. Group West had 4,629 militants, 59 tanks, 311 armored vehicles, along with 92 hoverits and mortars. With almost 15,000 men, about 200 tanks, and 1,000 various heavily armored machines, this group seemed like a decisive power, an indestructible army with a tenfold advantage compared to Chechen militaries. But there was a catch. Such an army was useless in the narrow streets of Grozny, and interaction between army units was almost absent. There were people who had never met each other before and had little no knowledge of how to act coherently, and worst of all, they didn't expect any resistance. Ironically, Russian intelligence was actually well aware of the Dive's defense plan. Not only did they know about the multi-layered fortifications in Grozny and the military supplies established on the city's southern border, but even the specific locations of strong points were not a secret. However, the commander-in-chief of the operation, General Kvashnin, ignored this data, believing that the Chechens were simply not capable of organized resistance. The prevailing sentiment in the Russian army is perfectly captured in this internal circular.
It is forbidden to occupy buildings other than administrative ones, to break benches, litter boxes, and other objects of housing and communal services. In case of encountering armed people, you must check their documents, seize their weapons, and shoot only as a last resort.
After the artillery barrage, Group West enters the city at 11 am, December 31st of 1994. Almost immediately, various parts of the group find themselves under a rapid fire. The group is separated, and in the absence of normal military communication, it's quickly dispersed in the city. Heavy armored vehicles jam the streets and become ideal aims for RPGs. Russian militants are completely disoriented. Tanks and armored personal carriers burn like matches. Fire dots are literally everywhere, each roof, each window. In the face of such fierce resistance, Group West stocks at 8:45 p.m. near Rodina Cinema and proceeds to circular defense while waiting for backup, which will never show up. Meanwhile, the Group East enters the city with no resistance. They quickly advance and gain control over the train station, then head towards the President's Palace. But near the city market, the military column encounters severe problems. Armored vehicles at the head and tail of the column are now on fire. The entire column is now jammed, and Russians are forced to take up defensive positions. Unable to suppress the fire from Chechen militants, the Russians attempt to retreat, not realizing that they are already
encircled.
The Chechens had allowed the Russian militants to enter the city center without any resistance, just to trap them. By 1 p.m., radio communication with the Group East is lost, and its offensive is completely thwarted. The Group Northeast, after successfully capturing control of the cannery, heads towards the city center. On their way, they overcome the resistance of Chechen militants at the Sunja River, and then on Ordzhonikidze Square, taking control of the hospital. Despite being semi-encircled and several instances of friendly fire, the Group Northeast managed to establish a foothold on new frontiers, and by the end of the day, it's the only group that accomplished its military tasks. But if you consider the defeat of the Group West and the Group East a disaster, it's still nothing compared to a nightmare that is waiting for the Group North, a pivotal striking force with a task to capture the President's Palace. At 6 am, the Group North enters the city with moderate resistance and reaches the crossroad of Adamirov and Nazarbayev streets, where a part of the group is sent to establish a position on the outskirts of Grozny. But due to misunderstandings and misrepresentation of the real combat situation, it would soon become separated into several battalions. 2 battalions are sent to the market and train station, while the rest reach Ordzhonikidze Square, where the column of military vehicles got jammed again. They received several controversial orders and finally sent to the train station as well. Concerning the control of the troops, officer in the field Vichkanov recalls:
The commander of the regiment gives the command, forward. I ask, what do you mean forward? Where? The task of the day is fulfilled, there is no infantry to cover the tanks. He says, go on. This is Polikovsky order. Keep it in mind. Now go to the station.
Eventually, the whole group is concentrated in columns along two streets, one near the train station and the other near the Dives Palace. A dramatic lack of urban warfare experience among Russian officers led to the absence of even elementary precautions. Equipment was neither hidden nor covered, and basic intelligence was absent. No contingency advice was given, and the Russians literally had no idea of what was happening in nearby buildings, especially considering the circular that, if you recall, prohibited the capture of non-administrative houses. This allowed Chechen militants to prepare their own strike group of 3,500 men, 50 armored vehicles, tanks, and 300 anti-tank RPGs. It's 7 p.m. and the twilight had just descended on Grozny. Chechen militants deploy their forces and the Group North is suddenly engaged in fierce battle. It is dark, and Russians, not familiar with the city, find themselves disoriented, as the Chechen militants were all locals. The battle quickly turns into a beating. One of the commanders, General Rochlin, recalls.
The Group North blocked the streets with armored vehicles, which couldn't turn around on the narrow city streets. Experienced fighters of Dudaev had already caught our tanks in the sights of rocket launchers, while the faces of our soldiers and officers were viewed through powerful optical sights of imported sniper rifles. When they pulled the triggers, their rocket launchers shot armored vehicles at point-blank range, first striking the head and tail of the column, and then destroying everything in the middle. The machines were unable to maneuver and burned like candles. Mortars showered the troops with a hail of mines.
The situation worsened when the groups East and West failed to carry out their tasks, leaving the Group North with no help.
The beating continued until the night, and then resumed at dawn. The attackers were as sophisticated as they could be.
The catastrophe of Russian forces in Grozny was tremendous. A complete defeat, to say the least. The army commanders had no idea whom they were dealing with, where and how, as they intended to conduct a mere police operation. No specific feasible and coherent orders, no logistics, no communication, poor knowledge of the battlefield, strategic underestimation of
bearded savages.
Finally, yet importantly, the attempt to invade an independent state and conquer an independent nation with brutal military force. These are the components of New Year's slaughterhouse cocktail that was served in Grozny in the end of 1994.
The defeat was absolute. The army command was in shock. Their main concern was obviously to find excuses for what had happened. The Minister of Defense, General Pavel Grachov, as I was told later, didn't leave his carriage in Mozdok and was drinking vodka incessantly.
Obviously, Russia couldn't accept the defeat in Grozny. The Russian government was determined to regain control over the region and take away the independence of Chechnya. Thus, on January the 3rd, the Operation Vengeance was announced, leading to a full-scale war between Russia and Ichkeria. The war that lasted for more than 2.5 years and resulted in a military defeat for Russian Federation, often referred to as a colossus with feet of clay. It is extremely disturbing to contemplate instances of such delusional imperialism, but what's truly sinister is to realize that decades after, nothing has changed. Russia again is denying other nation rights to exist. Russia again is engaged in cruel colonial war. Sometimes it feels like we will never learn our lessons, and the history will repeat itself in the most blatant and gruesome way, and then again, and again, and again. Thank you for staying with me. I'm the Northern Philosopher. Have a good one.